She may not make it past 3 o'clock. Those 7 words, spoken by a chief surgeon in a sunlit hallway at exactly 2 p.m., shattered a billionaire's world into a million pieces. Edward Cole stood frozen, watching his only daughter through a glass window as machines beeped their warning rhythms. Outside, the city carried on. Cars honked. People laughed. The afternoon sun blazed through the hospital windows as if nothing was ending. But inside room 417 of Cole Medical Center, the building that bore his own name in stone letters above the entrance, time was running out. Amelia Cole, 23 years old, brilliant, kind, and full of dreams her father never took time to understand, had exactly 1 hour left to live. The finest surgeons money could buy had tried everything. The rarest medications. The most advanced machines. Emergency calls to specialists in 3 different countries. None of it mattered. Her heart was failing faster than science could save it. What nobody knew, not the doctors in their white coats, not the billionaire pacing the corridor in his $1,000 suit, not even the nurses who had seen 100 miracles and 1,000 tragedies, was that somewhere in that same building, pushing a cleaning cart down a forgotten hallway, was a woman who would do something impossible. Her name was Lila. No one important knew her last name. She scrubbed floors for minimum wage, wore shoes with holes in the soles, and took 2 buses to get to work every morning. But in less than 1 hour, this invisible woman would stand between a father's worst nightmare and a daughter's last breath, armed with nothing but a prayer that would challenge everything the hospital believed about power, medicine, and what it truly means to save a life. By 3 p.m., one of 2 things would happen. Either Amelia would be gone, another name in the hospital's private records, another family destroyed by a condition money couldn't cure, or the world would witness something that no medical journal could fully explain, something that would force a powerful man to his knees and lift a poor woman into a purpose she never saw coming. This is that story. The story of one impossible hour. And it starts not with darkness, but with blinding afternoon light, the kind that hides nothing and reveals everything. To understand what happened when the clock struck 2 p.m., we need to go back. Back to who these people were before crisis made them collide. Back to the lives they lived in the same city, under the same sun, separated by walls that money built and tragedy would tear down. Before we go deeper, say hello in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if this is your first stop here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Edward Cole, and if you lived in this city, you knew that name. It was on buildings, on billboards, in the business section of every newspaper. He owned hotels that touched the clouds, tech companies that shaped how the world communicated, and enough wealth to buy anything except the 2 things he wanted most. More time with the wife he lost 5 years ago, and a real relationship with the daughter who was slipping away long before her heart began to fail. Edward had built his empire with ruthless focus. 16-hour days. Meetings that bled into midnight. Deals closed on golf courses and in private jets. He told himself it was all for family, for legacy, for security. But the truth, the one he wouldn't admit until it was almost too late, was that work was easier than presence. Contracts were simpler than conversations. Money could solve most problems except the ones that mattered. He'd missed Amelia's first piano recital because of a merger in Singapore. He'd forgotten her 16th birthday because quarterly reports were due. He'd promised to attend her high school graduation, and he did, but he spent the entire ceremony on his phone closing a deal worth $8 million. $8 million, and he couldn't remember a single word of her valedictorian speech. She'd stopped expecting him to show up after that. Stopped inviting him into her world. And he told himself it was fine, that she understood, that she knew he loved her even if he couldn't always be there. But love without presence is just a word. And Amelia had learned to live in a house full of expensive things and empty spaces. His daughter, Amelia, had grown up in a mansion with marble floors and empty rooms. She had everything a child could want except a father who was there. Not just physically but emotionally. Not just at dinner but in the details. A piano teacher from Vienna taught her to play Chopin. A French nanny taught her to speak 3 languages. But no one, not even her father, taught her that she was loved for who she was, not what she could become. She learned to crave his approval, and when she couldn't get it, she learned to stop asking. The silence between them grew wider with every passing year, until they were 2 strangers living under the same roof, connected by blood and last name but separated by everything that actually mattered. Amelia would sit at the piano for hours, playing pieces she hoped he might hear from his office down the hall. Sometimes he did hear, and he'd smile to himself, proud that his money had bought her such excellent training. But he never walked into the room. Never sat beside her on the bench. Never asked what the music meant to her or why she played the sad songs twice. Every Sunday, their driver would take them past the hospital Edward had donated $12 million to build. His name was carved in stone at the entrance, Cole Medical Center. Edward would glance at it with satisfaction, another checkbox on his legacy list. Amelia would stare at the people walking in and out, patients in wheelchairs, families holding hands in waiting rooms, a whole world of pain and hope her privileged life had never touched. She told her father more than once that she wanted to study medicine, to help people, to do something that mattered beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. He dismissed it every time. You can fund 100 doctors, Amelia. Why waste your potential being one of them? That sentence, spoken over breakfast in their sun-drenched dining room, was the moment she realized her father saw her as an investment, not a person. It was the moment the distance between them became a canyon neither knew how to cross. She'd applied to medical school anyway in secret, filling out applications late at night when the house was quiet and her father was asleep in his office chair, tie loosened, surrounded by contracts he valued more than conversations. She'd been accepted to 3 programs. She never told him. She wasn't sure he'd even notice if she left. Across town, in a neighborhood where the buildings leaned close together and laundry hung between fire escapes, another life was unfolding in a very different kind of sunlight. Lila woke every morning at 5 a.m. in a 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her aging mother. The walls were thin. The rent was late more often than it was on time. But the window faced east, and every sunrise felt like a promise that today might be different, might be better, might be the day something changed. She would make her mother tea, the cheap kind from the corner store, but she'd steep it carefully, add a little honey they'd saved from the diner down the street, and serve it like it was the finest blend money could buy. Her mother's hands shook from arthritis, so Lila would hold the cup steady, patient, never rushing, even when she knew the bus would leave in 12 minutes and the next one wouldn't come for 40. She'd kiss her mother's forehead, smooth the blanket over her lap, and leave a note on the table, "Lunch is in the fridge. I love you. Be back at 6. Then she'd take 2 buses to Cole Medical Center, where she worked as a cleaner on the 4th and 5th floors. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly noticed. But Lila had learned long ago that the most important work is often the most invisible. She mopped up blood after surgeries. She cleaned rooms after patients passed away, wiping down rails their hands had gripped, smoothing sheets their bodies had laid on, whispering quiet prayers over spaces still heavy with grief. Some of her co-workers thought she was strange for praying over empty rooms. But Lila believed that places held memory, that walls absorbed sorrow, and that someone needed to speak life back into spaces where death had visited. She'd learned that from her grandmother, a woman who had cleaned houses for 60 years and said that every room deserved respect, whether it belonged to the rich or the dying. Lila carried that belief with her every day, treating each hospital room like sacred ground because to someone, it had been. To someone, that room was where they'd heard the worst news of their life. Or the best. Or the last words someone they loved ever spoke. She saw things the doctors didn't have time to see. The elderly man in 512 who refused his medication until someone sat with him for 5 minutes and listened to stories about his late wife. The young mother in 407 who cried silently every night after visiting hours because she didn't want her kids to see her fear. The nurse who hid in the supply closet on her breaks, overwhelmed and underpaid, holding back tears behind boxes of gauze and gloves. Lila noticed. And when she could, when no one was watching, she would sit beside them. Hold a hand. Hum a song. Offer a prayer. Not because it was her job, but because she had learned, through years of watching people walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't in a bottle. It's in presence, in witnessing, in refusing to let someone suffer alone. She'd seen patients rally after a kind word. She'd seen families find peace after someone simply acknowledged their pain. She didn't have a medical degree, but she had something just as valuable: the ability to see people, really see them, in a world that had trained most people to look away. Lila had faith, the kind that didn't come from a comfortable pew or a Sunday sermon. It came from standing in hospital rooms where hope was thin and seeing, just often enough, something unexplainable happen. A patient who wasn't supposed to wake up, opening their eyes. A diagnosis that reversed itself. A family that found peace even in goodbye. She didn't expect miracles, but she never stopped asking for them. And on one bright, terrible afternoon, that habit of asking, that refusal to accept when everyone else had given up, would turn her into the most important person in a building full of specialists and million-dollar machines. She'd been praying since she was a child, not because someone taught her the right way to do it, but because talking to God felt as natural as breathing. When her father left, she prayed. When her brother died, she prayed. When the rent was overdue and the lights got shut off, she prayed. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. Sometimes it was wait. But she kept asking, kept believing that somewhere beyond the ceiling in the sky and the silence, someone was listening. Amelia and Lila had never met. They lived in the same city, walked the same hospital halls, breathed the same air. But their worlds were separated by money, class, and the invisible walls society builds to keep people in their lanes. That was about to change. It was supposed to be a beautiful day. One of those rare afternoons where everything felt possible. The Cole estate was hosting a charity luncheon. White tents in the garden. A string quartet. Champagne glasses catching sunlight like little prisms. Photographers capturing the elegant crowd, the kind of people who donated thousands and called it giving back. Amelia had agreed to perform. She would play a piano piece she'd been practicing for weeks, and all proceeds from the event would go to the pediatric wing of her father's hospital. It was a compromise, her small rebellion. If he wouldn't let her be a doctor, at least she could fund the ones who were. She'd chosen a piece by Debussy, something beautiful and melancholic, something that felt like longing. She didn't realize as she sat down at the piano bench that it would be the last song she'd play before everything changed. At 1:07 p.m., she sat down at the grand piano under an open gazebo. The garden smelled like roses and fresh-cut grass. Guests turned to watch, smiling, sipping their drinks. Edward stood to the side, checking his phone, half present as always. He was reading an email about a property acquisition in Dubai, barely hearing the first notes his daughter played. At 1:11 p.m., Amelia's fingers stumbled. Just one wrong note. She blinked, confused. The sunlight seemed too sharp, like it was pressing against her eyes. Her left hand began to tremble. She tried to steady it, to keep playing, but the world tilted. The garden spun in a blur of color and sound. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. She felt her chest tighten, a pressure like someone was standing on her ribs. She tried to call for help, but her voice wouldn't come. Someone gasped. A glass shattered. And then Amelia collapsed sideways off the piano bench, her body hitting the ground as the keys let out a discordant crash that silenced the entire event. People screamed. Edward dropped his phone and ran, his heart already knowing what his mind refused to accept. He fell to his knees beside her, hands shaking, not knowing what to do. Someone yelled to call 911. Someone else, a retired cardiologist, started chest compressions. Amelia's lips were turning blue. Her eyes were half open but unseeing. Edward gripped her hand and said her name over and over, like repetition could bring her back. Paramedics were called. In the chaos, someone remembered that Amelia's mother had died 5 years earlier from a rare, undiagnosed heart condition. The doctors had assured Edward that Amelia was fine, that she'd been tested, that lightning didn't strike twice. But as he knelt beside his daughter's unconscious body in the middle of his perfect garden party, he realized that wealth had made him arrogant. He'd believed money could protect her from everything, even genetics. He'd believed that because he'd donated millions to build a hospital, his family would somehow be exempt from the tragedies that happened inside it. By 1:32 p.m., Amelia was in an ambulance racing toward Cole Medical Center. Edward rode with her, holding her hand, whispering promises he should have made years ago. I'll be there. I'll do better. I'll listen. Just stay. Please stay. By 1:40 p.m., she was surrounded by doctors in the emergency bay. By 1:55 p.m., they knew. Sudden cardiac event. Massive damage. A hidden condition that had been building silently for years, waiting for the wrong moment to detonate. They worked fast. Scans. IVs. Medications. Machines. Edward stood outside the trauma room, watching through the glass, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the wall to stay upright. He saw them pumping her chest. Saw the defibrillator charge. Saw her body jolt and fall. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the building down. He wanted to rewind time and be the father he should have been from the beginning. At 2 p.m., the chief surgeon stepped out. His face said everything before his mouth did. Mr. Cole, we're doing everything we can, but her heart is failing faster than we can intervene. If she doesn't stabilize in the next hour... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Edward heard the unspoken end of that sentence as clearly as if it had been shouted. She may not make it past 3 o'clock. The surgeon walked back into the room. Edward stood alone in a hallway flooded with afternoon sunlight, the irony not lost on him that he was standing in a building with his name on it, surrounded by equipment he had paid for, and none of it could save the only person he truly loved. He thought about all the hours he'd wasted, all the moments he'd chosen work over her, all the times he'd said later, and later never came. If she died, he would have to live with that. The knowledge that he'd had 23 years to be her father, and he'd only shown up for a fraction of them. The weight of that realization brought him to his knees right there in the hallway, a broken man in an expensive suit, powerless for the first time in his life. Down the hall, Lila was finishing her cleaning route on the 4th floor. She was thinking about groceries, about her mother's prescription that needed refilling, about whether she could pick up an extra shift this weekend. Then she heard the whispers. Staff rushing past, voices low and urgent. Cole's daughter. Cardiac arrest. ICU. Lila froze. She knew the name, of course. Everyone who worked at the hospital knew that name. It was on their paychecks, on the walls, on the plaques in every wing. But she had never seen the man himself, had never been in the same room as the family whose money kept the lights on. She didn't know that in a few minutes, her world and his were about to collide in a way that would change both of them forever. She pushed her cart toward the ICU not out of curiosity, but because that was her assignment for the afternoon. The higher floors. The private rooms. The ones with thicker carpets and quieter machines. As she approached, she saw him. A man in an expensive suit, leaning against the glass of an ICU room, his whole body shaking. She saw the doctors moving inside the room with controlled urgency. She saw the monitors flashing numbers she didn't fully understand but recognized as bad. And then she saw the girl. Young. Pale. Connected to tubes and wires, her chest barely rising. Lila felt something crack open in her chest. She had seen this before. Too many times. The way families stood outside glass walls, helpless. The way hope drained from a room like air from a punctured tire. Years ago, in a rural clinic far from this shining city, Lila had stood beside a wooden cot and watched her little brother die. He was only 7. Fever had taken him in 3 days. The nurse had said the same thing the surgeon probably just said. There's nothing more we can do. That sentence had haunted Lila for 2 decades. It echoed in her dreams. It whispered in every hospital hallway she cleaned. And she had made a promise to herself, to God, to the memory of a little boy who never got a chance, that she would never accept that sentence without a fight. Not a physical fight. Not a medical one. But a spiritual one. A refusal to let despair have the last word. She didn't plan what happened next. She didn't think it through. She just moved. Before we continue, does this part hit you the way it hit me? Tell me in the comments with one word: shocked, sad, confused, or angry. I want to see how you're feeling so far. Lila approached the man by the glass. He was so lost in his grief he didn't notice her at first. Sir, she said softly. Edward turned. His eyes were red, wet. He saw a cleaning woman in a faded uniform, and for a split second, irritation flashed across his face. This was not the time. Please, I can't. He started. I know, sir. I'm sorry. I just heard about your daughter, Lila said, her voice gentle, respectful. She twisted the cleaning rag in her hands, nervous but compelled. Something in her spirit wouldn't let her walk past this man's pain without acknowledging it. Edward exhaled, his shoulders sagging. He didn't have the energy to send her away. There's nothing anyone can do. They've tried everything, he said, his voice hollow. The doctors have, yes, sir. And they're the best. I see them every day, Lila replied. She paused, then took a breath. But where I come from, when the doctors finish, we believe someone else might still be listening. Edward frowned. I didn't build this hospital for prayers. I built it for results, he said, but there was no strength behind the words. Just exhaustion. Just fear. I understand, sir. But if you'd allow me, I'd like to pray for her anyway. Just for a moment. It won't interfere with what they're doing, Lila said. She looked at him with eyes that held no judgment, no pity, just a quiet certainty that unnerved him. Edward had not prayed since his wife's funeral. He'd stopped believing in anything he couldn't control, couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate with. Prayer felt like talking to the ceiling. Like admitting defeat. But standing there with 58 minutes left on a countdown he couldn't stop, he realized control was an illusion. Everything he'd built, everything he'd earned, couldn't buy him one more second with his daughter if her heart decided to stop. You really think it would matter? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. I've seen things the charts can't explain. Not every time. But enough times to never stop asking, Lila said. Edward looked at her worn shoes, her tired face, the absolute sincerity in her expression. He thought about how much he'd spent on this hospital. On the equipment. On the staff. On the marble floors and the state-of-the-art technology. And here stood a woman who probably made in a year what he spent on a weekend trip, offering the only thing she had. And somehow, in that moment, it felt more valuable than anything he owned. And then he stepped aside. "They won't just let you in," he said. As if on cue, the door opened. A nurse stepped out, pulling off her gloves, her face grim. Lila caught her eye. "Please, I just want to stand by her bed for 1 minute. I won't touch anything. I promise," Lila said. The nurse looked at Edward, saw the desperation in his face, saw a man who had run out of options and was grasping at anything, even faith. Then she looked back at Lila, recognizing her from the hallways, remembering how she'd once sat with the nurse's own mother when she'd been a patient here, just sat and held her hand when no one else had time. Protocol wrestled with compassion. Compassion won. 1 minute. "Don't touch the equipment," the nurse said quietly. Lila nodded. "Thank you. God bless you." She stepped into the room. The door closed softly behind her. It was 2:35 p.m. 25 minutes had already passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence between machine beeps. Lila walked slowly to the bedside. She placed one hand on the railing, careful not to touch Amelia, honoring the rules. She bowed her head. Her prayer was not fancy. It was not loud. But it was real. "God, I don't understand why so many people leave this place. I've cleaned their rooms after. I've wiped their tears off the floor. I've heard families scream your name in anger and whisper it in hope. But this girl, she's someone's whole world. If there's any life you can still give, if there's any mercy left today, please don't let her go. Not yet. Not because of who her father is. Not because of the name on the building. But because you're still God even when the doctors say it's over. You're still God when the machines fail. You're still God in the gap between what medicine can do and what only you can do. Please." As she prayed, nothing exploded. No alarms went off. No dramatic surge. But something small, almost imperceptible, shifted. Amelia's fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered. The waveform on the heart monitor, which had been steadily weakening, ticked up. Just 3%. Barely noticeable. But the nurse monitoring from the station saw it. She frowned, leaned closer to the screen. That wasn't supposed to happen. The trend had been going one direction for 30 minutes. Downward. And now, for no reason the chart could explain, it had ticked up. Lila opened her eyes and looked at Amelia's face. "I don't know you," she whispered. "But there's a father who does. You don't have to be afraid. If there's any fight left in you, don't stop now. Your father's outside that door and he needs you. Maybe you needed him and he wasn't there. I don't know your story. But I know he's here now. And he's breaking. So if you can fight, fight. Not for him. For you. For every dream you haven't lived yet. For every sunrise you haven't seen." She stepped back, tears running down her cheeks. She had done what she came to do. As she turned toward the door, the monitor beeped a little stronger. A doctor passing by glanced at the screen, did a double take and walked quickly into the room. "What changed?" he asked the nurse inside. "Nothing. No medication adjustments in the last 15 minutes, the nurse replied, checking the chart with confusion in her eyes. The doctor stared at the numbers. They weren't good, but they were better. Incrementally, inexplicably better. He checked the 4 lines, the ventilator settings, everything that could account for the change. Nothing had been touched. "Keep monitoring. If this holds, we might have a chance," he said, cautious hope creeping into his professional tone. Lila slipped out of the room. Edward's eyes locked on hers immediately. "What happened? What did you do?" he asked, his voice intense, searching her face for answers. "I prayed, sir. That's all I know how to do," Lila said simply. Before he could respond, the nurse approached him. "Mr. Cole, we're seeing some improvement. Small but real. She's stabilizing a bit. We're still critical, but it's more than we had 10 minutes ago," the nurse said carefully, not wanting to give false hope but unable to deny what the monitors were showing. Edward looked from the nurse to Lila to the room where his daughter lay. For the first time in his life, he had to consider a possibility that his worldview had no room for. That the most powerful person in this building might be the one everyone ignored. That the answer to his crisis hadn't come from the people he paid 6 figures, but from a woman who mopped floors for barely above minimum wage. It challenged everything he believed about how the world worked. About who mattered. About where real power lived. The next 20 minutes were agony. Amelia's vitals climbed slightly, dipped, climbed again. The doctors supported every small gain, adjusting fluids, recalibrating machines. They credited the medication finally taking hold, the body's resilience kicking in at the last possible moment. Edward stood at the glass, hands pressed against it, silently begging for every number to rise. Lila stood down the hall, leaning against the wall, her lips moving in continuous, silent prayer. She prayed for Amelia. She prayed for the doctors. She prayed for Edward. She even prayed for herself, that if this was a moment God was moving, she wouldn't get in the way of it. At 2:50 p.m., Amelia's heart rhythm strengthened just enough for the lead cardiologist to exhale with something resembling cautious hope. At 2:55 p.m., her oxygen levels stabilized. At 2:58 p.m., the chief surgeon checked the latest readouts and allowed himself a small nod. "Mr. Cole, I don't want to promise anything yet, but if this continues she may make it past the hour," he said carefully, each word measured, not wanting to jinx the fragile progress. Edward felt his knees nearly buckle. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it. He gripped the wall to keep from collapsing. The clock ticked toward 3 p.m. The second hand swept past the 12. 3 p.m. exactly. The monitors beeped steadily. Amelia was still alive. Not healed. Not awake. But alive when an hour ago she was supposed to be gone. Sometimes a miracle is not a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's just the continuation of a heartbeat when it was supposed to stop. Lila closed her eyes and looked up, silently mouthing thank you to a ceiling that suddenly felt less like plaster and more like a thin place between earth and something greater. She didn't take credit. She never did. But she felt a deep, bone-level gratitude that today the answer had been yes. Today a father would get another chance. A daughter would get another breath. And maybe, just maybe, two strangers would learn to see each other as more than their job titles and bank balances. Recovery took weeks. There were setbacks, complications, moments when it seemed the reprieve had only delayed the inevitable. But Amelia's heart kept fighting. Slowly, painfully, against all odds, her body began to heal. Doctors ran tests, wrote papers, used words like anomaly and spontaneous recovery. None of them could fully explain it. The data didn't support the outcome. The projections had been clear. And yet, here she was defying every statistical model they'd built. Edward spent every day at her bedside. He canceled meetings. Ignored emails. Let deals fall through. His assistant called 14 times the first day. He turned his phone off. For the first time in decades, he chose presence over profit. And when Amelia finally opened her eyes 4 days after that impossible hour, the first thing she saw was her father's face, older and more broken and more present than she'd ever seen it. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd only removed that morning. "I'm here," he said, gripping her hand like it was the only thing tethering him to earth. "I'm right here. And I'm not leaving. Not ever again." She wanted to believe him. But years of disappointment had taught her to guard her hope. Still, something in his eyes was different. The distance was gone. The distraction. For the first time in her life, she had her father's full attention. And it had only cost her a near-death experience to get it. The thought made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. Weeks later, when she was strong enough to sit up, strong enough to take a few steps with a walker, strong enough to ask questions, Edward told her about Lila. About the prayer. About the moment the numbers changed. Amelia listened quietly, processing, trying to fit the pieces together. "I want to meet her," she said finally. "I was hoping you'd say that," Edward replied. He asked the hospital administrator to find Lila. It took them a while. She was just one name on a long list of support staff. When she arrived at his office, still in her uniform, she looked small and out of place among the leather chairs and polished wood. Edward stood when she entered. "Lila, I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't know how to name. "Sir, the doctors." She started, backing toward the door like she'd made a mistake by coming. "The doctors did their job and I'm grateful. But you did something they couldn't. You walked in when everyone else had emotionally walked out," Edward said. He walked to the window looking out at the city sprawling below. "People will say it was coincidence. Timing. Medicine working. Maybe it was all of that. But I can't ignore that the moment you prayed, something shifted." Lila looked down, uncomfortable with credit. "It's not me, sir. It's never me. I just ask. Sometimes the answer is no. That day it was yes." Edward turned back to her. "I've spent my whole life believing the most important people were the ones with degrees and titles and bank accounts. I surrounded myself with people who looked like me, talked like me, had the same education and opportunities. But the day my daughter almost died, the only person who stood between us and despair was a woman this system barely sees. A woman I would have walked past without a second glance." He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. "You reminded me that there's a kind of power in this world that has nothing to do with money. And I want to honor that." He handed her a folder. Inside was a scholarship for any education she wanted. A raise that would triple her current salary. Health coverage for her mother. A new position in patient support services where her gift for seeing people could be used, not hidden. Tears streamed down Lila's face. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Then just keep doing what you do. And let my daughter meet the woman who refused to give up on her," Edward said. A week later, in the hospital's quiet garden under the afternoon sun, Amelia and Lila sat on the same bench. Birds sang in the trees. The fountain bubbled softly. It felt like a different world from the ICU. "You're Lila," Amelia said, smiling, studying the woman who had become part of her story. "Yes, ma'am," Lila replied, nervous, twisting her hands in her lap. "Just Amelia, please. My father says I owe you my life." "You owe your life to God and those doctors." "I was just there," Lila said quickly, deflecting as always. Amelia looked up at the sky, gathering her thoughts. "When I was unconscious, I remember something. Like a dream. A voice telling me not to be afraid. To fight. I think it was you." Lila's eyes filled. "I did say that. By your bed. The sun was so bright that day. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so terrible was happening in the middle of such a beautiful afternoon." Amelia reached over and took Lila's hand. Two women. Two worlds. One impossible afternoon that changed everything. They sat there for a long time, not needing to fill the silence with words. Sometimes presence is enough. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone is the miracle. Amelia enrolled in medical school. She'd been accepted months ago but had never told her father. Now she did. And instead of arguing, he helped her move into her dorm. He carried boxes. He met her roommates. He took her to dinner and actually listened when she talked about her dreams. Edward established a fund for healthcare workers, scholarships and grants for people like Lila who had the gift of compassion but not the means for formal training. And on the wall of a new wing, a plaque was unveiled. Not with his name, but with words that would outlast any fortune. The Caregiver's Wing. Dedicated to those whose invisible hands hold the world together. The day of the unveiling, Lila stood in the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention. Edward had insisted she be there. When the curtain dropped and the plaque was revealed, the crowd applauded. Edward found her in the audience and gestured for her to come forward. She shook her head, but he insisted. Reluctantly, she walked to the front. "This woman," Edward said to the gathered crowd of donors and staff and press, "saved my daughter's life. Not with medicine. Not with money. But with something our world has forgotten how to value. She saw a stranger and treated her like family. She had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and she stepped forward anyway. If we want to change healthcare, we don't just need better technology. We need more people like Lila." The applause was thunderous. Lila wiped her eyes, overwhelmed. After the ceremony, a young nurse approached her. "I've seen you around for years," the nurse said. "I never knew your name." "I'm sorry for that." Lila smiled. "It's okay. I'm used to being invisible." "You're not invisible anymore," the nurse replied. In the end, no one could prove that Lila's prayer saved Amelia. The medical records showed medication response, cardiac stabilization, expected variables within an unexpected timeline. But some stories aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be lived. On that sunlit afternoon, when a billionaire had everything except the one thing that mattered, and a maid had nothing except a faith that refused to quit, time stopped counting down to an ending and started counting up to a beginning. Maybe the real miracle wasn't that a girl survived. Maybe it was that a powerful man learned the value of a person has nothing to do with the size of their bank account. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest power in any room is held by the one willing to step forward when everyone else has stepped back. Edward and Amelia's relationship didn't transform overnight. There were still awkward silences. Still moments when his phone rang and she saw him hesitate, old habits pulling at him. But he was trying. And she saw that. She saw him choose her over a conference call. She saw him ask about her day and actually wait for the answer. She saw him become, slowly, the father she'd always needed. Lila's life changed too. She took the scholarship and enrolled in a nursing program. It was hard, going back to school at 34, sitting in classes with kids half her age. But she loved it. She loved learning the science behind the compassion she'd always practiced. And when she graduated 2 years later, Amelia was in the audience, cheering louder than anyone. Lila got a job at Cole Medical Center, this time as a patient advocate. She walked the halls she used to clean, but now she had a different kind of authority. She could speak up for patients who felt unheard. She could slow down doctors who were moving too fast. She could sit with families in their worst moments and remind them they weren't alone. One afternoon she was called to the ICU. A family had just received devastating news. Their son, 19 years old, had been in a car accident. The doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Lila heard those words and felt the old familiar ache. She walked into the waiting room. The mother was collapsed in a chair, sobbing. The father stood by the window, fists clenched, angry at God and the world. Lila sat down beside the mother. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "Can I sit with you?" The mother looked up, eyes red. "Are you a doctor?" "No," Lila said. "I'm just someone who believes that even when the doctors are finished, there's still someone listening." The mother stared at her, then nodded. Lila took her hand. And she prayed. Not for a miracle, though she always hoped, but for peace, for strength, for the family to feel held even in the falling. The son passed away 2 hours later. But the mother told Lila weeks afterward that those 2 hours were bearable because someone had sat with her. Someone had reminded her she wasn't alone in the worst moment of her life. That's what Lila did now. She showed up. She stayed. She reminded people that their pain mattered, that their loved ones mattered, that even in loss they were seen. If you were in that hallway watching the clock, watching a father break, would you have believed a simple prayer could change anything? What would you have done in Lila's place? Would you have stayed silent or stepped forward? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your stories, your beliefs, your experiences with moments that defied explanation. And if this story reminded you that every life has value, no matter their title or tax bracket, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who feels invisible. Someone who wonders if their small act of kindness could ever matter. Because this is just one story. 1 hour. One prayer. But imagine how many more are unfolding right now in hospitals and homes and corners of the world where cameras never go. Stories where the forgotten save the powerful. Where love, not money, writes the ending. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because if you thought this story was impossible, wait until you hear what happened when a homeless man walked into a courtroom and said 5 words that stopped an execution. That story is coming next. But for now, I'll leave you with this. What if the miracle you're praying for isn't coming from above, but from beside you? From the person you've overlooked, underestimated, walked past every single day? Edward learned that lesson the hard way. But he learned it. And it saved more than his daughter's life. It saved his soul. It gave him a purpose bigger than profit. It taught him that legacy isn't what you build with money. It's what you build with moments. With presence. With the courage to let people see you broken. He started a foundation in Amelia's name, funding medical research for cardiac conditions. But more than that, he funded programs that trained healthcare workers in compassion, in seeing patients as people, in sitting with families even when there was nothing left to do medically. Because he'd learned that the most important medicine is often the most invisible. And Lila, the woman who had been invisible for so long, became the face of that movement. She spoke at conferences, trained staff, shared her story. Not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted people to understand that everyone, no matter how small their role seems, has the power to change a life. One prayer. One presence. One moment of choosing to step forward instead of walking past. That's all it takes. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. I'll see you in the next one.